Okay, good day everyone, and welcome to today's third-party risk management fireside chat. My name's Duncan Reid. I'm marketing manager for DVV Solutions. Just a few quick housekeeping notes before we get started. To help reduce any background noise or interference during the session, we have placed all attendees on mute. The session is being recorded and will be made available as soon as possible. You can submit questions during the session using the Q&A button in the top banner. That should open a pop-up window. Where possible, we try to address these as we go along, but we'll bring any specific questions up during a brief Q&A section we've allowed time for at the end. Today, we're delighted to be supported by our partner Supplier Wisdom to discuss the evolving challenges and key success factors excuse me, for supply chain risk management programs learned from the coalface from two experienced and seasoned risk professionals. And with that, please allow me to introduce Stefan Ward. Stefan has over 30 years experience in the management of risk in some of the most complex and challenging environments from a risk perspective. He spent time as interim CRO for Clearbank and head of IT risk at TSB, and Stefan ran the third-party risk operations at Nationwide Building Society, subsequently holding the position of head of risk for relationships and distribution. Most recently, Stefan supported the merger of the London Stock Exchange and Refinitiv and its associated IT risk functions. He's currently supporting a European financial services organisation to apply for their full banking licence for the UK, and also volunteers as chair of the supervisory board for the Wiltshire and Swindon Credit Union. I'm also delighted to welcome Shelley Leibowitz. Shelley is a seasoned corporate director and has served on public company governance, audit, risk and technology committees, as well as on the boards of emerging technology companies, advising them in areas of digital transformation, IT portfolio and risk management, info security and digital trust, performance metrics and effective governance. Previously the World Bank's first group-wide CIO, Shelley currently serves on the board of directors of Morgan Stanley, where she sits on the audit and operations and technology committees, and on the board of Elastic, where she sits on the audit and nominating and governance committees. It should be noted that Stefan and Shelley speak as individuals and their personal views do not represent those of their respective organisations. Chairing today's discussion will be Sean O'Brien, MD of DVV Solutions. Sean's a practicing certified third-party risk professional and assessor with over 25 years hands-on experience of delivering IT security and GRC managed services within highly regulated industries. In addition to the day job, Sean is a founding member of the EMEA Steering Committee for the Shared Assessments Programme and also sits on their Best Practices Committee. Sean, if I can hand over to you and help provide a little background with the responses to our questions on the three key PRM challenges faced by our audience.
Super, thank you very much, Duncan, and welcome everybody. So as part of the registration process, we asked a few key questions and wanted to look at what the key concerns were in relation to third-party risk for 2022 for the audience we're speaking to today. So these slides will be made available after the event, so you don't need to take any notes. But it's quite interesting to look at where people are perceiving their greatest level of attention is needed. As we can see, cyber heads are the top 10 are by a significant amount, with data flowing extensively throughout the globe, and the number of threats increasing and changing on a daily basis. It's interesting to see that the respondents gave compliance as the second largest priority, and we'll probably explore that a little bit more in some of our discussions. Interestingly, there was a change as the registration went through, and ESG risk has come up the rankings fairly significantly the more people are registered for this event. So we'll take some time out and talk about that as well. Equally, there are lots of other areas that we asked people about, and fourth and end party and things like concentration risk in relation to it. came pretty high up the league table, as well as general analysis and reporting, and how you deliver that information up to the board. So lots and lots to talk about there. Thanks, Duncan. All right, if we could close that down and move to the just the Fireside chat group. Thank you very much, sir. So if I kick off today, guys, first of all, in terms of those priorities, Shelley, all right, what in terms of those resonate with you? All right, you've got a very wide degree of experience in a large number of organisations. All right, what is the kind of priorities for you? And you know, did any of that, all right, resonate with you?
So thank you, Sean, and it's a pleasure to be here. We are really in a whole new phase, and I think we start at the broadest level. We were talking about this actually before the session started. It is hard to describe the idea that we are in a post-pandemic climate change, war between Russia and Ukraine, ransomware, SolarWinds, Log4j environment, and people in the business world are supposed to be able to make sense of all that. And so I would start with the idea that the breadth of issues companies are dealing with is greater than I've seen in my professional career. It's interesting. As Duncan mentioned, I had the great pleasure of serving as head of technology for the World Bank Group in Washington, and that was in the early 2010s. And I remember issues of the financial crisis and the financial contagion and the Tokyo earthquake that led to the issues in Fukushima with the nuclear plant and the Arab Spring. And I remember kind of having a real visceral reaction to the interconnectedness of the world. And we are orders of magnitude beyond that. So the interesting question that I ask as a board member is, how do we take all these very real and very significant issues and operationalize them? How do you deal with those things? And I know we have listeners today who are from many large enterprises and many complex enterprises. And so it all has to be done in a risk-informed way. So I always go back to an enterprise risk management framework, which is a matter of looking holistically at all the risks and then being able to have the data and the information to risk rank, to risk inform, to understand materiality. Because if you can't figure out what's important, then you can't figure out where to take action, because it's all just fundamentally too complex, too overwhelming to treat everything as an equal issue.
Super. And Stefan, your thoughts on?
So let me absolutely agree with Shelley, and it's great to be here once again with you, Sean, and DVV and Supply Wisdom. Absolutely agree with what Shelley's described, but let's take it from the ground up from a CRO perspective, and that whole piece around data, because the interconnectedness of everything these days, the implications of these major global events that are taking place right now mean that the very complex environment that our supply chain sits in is made even more complex. So we were already struggling to get the data that allowed us to make risk-based decisions within our enterprise risk management framework. As a CRO, I always felt incredibly nervous that I couldn't see where the risks actually lay within my supply chain. And you know, we've got the regulators asking for more and more, and it's interesting. There's no section on the challenge pie chart that you've got around operational resilience. Now, operational resilience probably covers a multitude of those areas. So, for me, as I did it nationwide, I started out by initially understanding my principal customer journeys and where the pain points could be on those customer journeys, to try and start to identify at the very least what were my key suppliers in my supply chain that supported these key customer journeys, and those moments of truth where the customer relied upon us to pay bills or, make payments or, whatever the situation was. And I think if you look at cyber risk, if you look at fourth and fifth party operational risk, all of those risks come into play within your customer journey, and the failure of the supplier to be able to do the job that they have been contracted to do. But even then, you are looking at tens, if not hundreds of suppliers that are really important to the organization. And one thing as a CRO I've not been able to do is gain the data that enables me to make those risk-based decisions at a moment, at a real point in time. Yes, we can use organizations to do point-in-time assessments, but they're usually annual. So the data suddenly very quickly starts to degrade. And as an organization, I was trying to sort of encourage organizations that I've worked with to really start to understand the currency of the information that we have available and where it's pointing us to potential failure in our service. But even that is incredibly difficult because you've got only so many staff who can look at so much information manually. And there's very little artificial intelligence yet that gives us that quantity of data to be able to break it down and really focus our efforts in the supply chain. So it's incredibly complex.
And because we're now talking, significantly across the board in terms of risk domains, in terms of cyber, cyber is typically information security, data privacy, and now predominantly operational resiliency, although it was disaster recovery, business continuity. So, the scope has already grown and increased there. And I'm glad you've raised operational resiliency because it's very much front and centre, certainly until the 31st of March and hopefully beyond that, all right, for a lot of financial regulations in the UK. The deadline for operational resiliency requirements with the FCA PRA Shelley is due on the 31st of March. So, those regulations are already pushing you not just to look at your material outsourcers, your critical and your highs, but also your material subcontractors in relation to those as well. So not only the number of risk domains you're looking at, but the depth that you're being asked from a regulator to look at is increasing exponentially as well. So I agree totally, Stefan. I think there are distinct benefits to questionnaires. It is an attestation, all right, but it is a trust model. All right, and in terms of that, there are things that you can glean from that. You can glean an idea of an organisation and their structure and their level of maturity from a on-site or virtual on-site, as we've all been carrying out over the past couple of years now. You can start to look and prove whether they are doing what they say they do. You can look at the process and look at the test evidence in relation to it, but it's certainly from a general perspective, they are very much point in time. All right. So you might well be, for a critical or a high, carrying out a questionnaire once every 6 months, generally once every 12 months. But for a medium, all right, which, mediums and low cover the vast number of suppliers to organizations, you're probably only going to be carrying out that, once every 2 or 3 years, or indeed, if at all, for a lot of lows. And I think, Shelley mentioned, Log4j and some of the other kind of major issues there. Most people were not even looking at those kind of issues, all right, prior to that. And most of those were medium or low risk suppliers in a great number of instances. So the challenges are increasing exponentially. So if I may, another question to you then, Stefan. What do you see, all right, in your current roles, all right, are the challenges for you in relation to some of the risks we've identified?
I think for me, it's being able to gain confidence that the risk landscape that our supply chain presents against the material risk takers and their decisions that they're taking. And what I mean by that is a lot of organizations put third party or supply chain risk as a separate risk category, which might be totally appropriate, but actually, what is that telling us? What do those suppliers represent in terms of our control framework that sits against technology or sits against the various other risk categories within the organization? And if they're deteriorating, what decisions are the risk takers making to ensure that the technology platform, the resiliency is ensured against that information? So if you have it over to one side, supply chain and third-party risk management, have you done all your assessments? Have you done the questionnaires, and are they up to date? That's all well and good, but what about the intervening period in that time? Are we seeing a deterioration in their financial stability or their top technology capability? And how are we then feeding that into our key risks that always exist, the cyber, the operational risk, resiliency type conversations, fin crime, all of those key risks that an organization sees at the top of their pyramid of reporting every month? And where does supplier actually feed into that? Because you could have a very low risk supply, third party risk rating, but actually the suppliers are deteriorating and they are impacting our ability to provide the service to our customers, and therefore they should be represented in those other risk areas. And that concept isn't very easy for people to pull through in their risk reporting. And the easy decisions as to where to spend money tend to be those that are focused internally. So we know what technology platforms we own that we need to, reduce the legacy against, et cetera, et cetera. So we make those decisions, but we're not focusing time, effort, and resource against our supply chain, who are equally likely to undermine our capability for our customers. Hopefully that makes sense, Sean.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And Shelley, do you have anything to add? I think certainly in previous discussions, people was pretty much front and center of mind for you in terms of resource. Certainly we've experienced exponential growth in requirement for risk analysts in the UK over the past 18 months, and salaries have increased in proportion to that. But what's your experience?
No, I'd love to jump in. And I would say the expectations have increased in terms of not just sort of the number of people required and what they will be doing, but the capabilities. So maybe I could make 3 points. The first is, I love a phrase that I saw in a McKinsey article, and it was something along the lines of, we've moved from risk management to strategic resiliency. And to me, that's a great phrase, because it is, when I think of framing it from the cyber world, it is a sense and respond. It is a detect and respond. It is a continuous process. It's not a static process. And so it's the difference between risk management, which tends to be passive and backward looking, and resiliency, which is forward looking and anticipatory. So the second point I'd love to make is, as a board member, I want leading indicators, right? So there's a lot, audit, frankly, is about looking at our control environment and what exists, and seeing how effective that control environment is. To me, risk and resiliency is looking forward in an active defense mode and being able to predict and ideally prevent, or at a minimum respond to issues. So it's looking for leading indicators that allow you to be ahead of issues. And I think that's a very big difference in terms of mindset and how organizations operate. And oh, by the way, more and more in the UK, in the US, certainly in regulated industries in the financial world, companies are being asked to be able to not only demonstrate and describe this, but publicly disclose these capabilities. So again, there's a whole other level of expectation. And what that requires, which I think Stefan said really well, is It really all relies on data and systems. So you can't do this. You can't be proactive and anticipatory with spreadsheets. And you can't do it based on point in time, annual, semi-annual, whatever, questionnaires. So oftentimes we talk about requirements being either broad or deep. Guess what? The requirements for data here are broad and deep and current. So 3 different really important axes. I won't say real time because I'm not sure that's the right answer. I just would like to say current, which is sort of the best available information appropriate for the kinds of problems we're looking to solve. And again, spreadsheets can't do that. You need much more sophisticated systems that can bring in all this broad and deep and rich data and curate it, and then put intelligence on top of it, figure out where the risks are, help prioritize those risks, send up alerts, but alerts with a high fidelity rate, because an overwhelming amount of alerts is not helpful, and then be able to, this is the holy grail, obviously, and then be able to integrate those alerts into workflow. But fundamentally, that's the model that institutions, certainly the financial institutions, are being asked to move toward and demonstrate progress toward, and that is not a spreadsheet way of operating.
Yeah, agreed. I think I did another kind of fireside chat with shared assessments a couple of weeks ago, and there was a lady who was on the conversation with me, and she works for a credit union in the US, and she has the responsibility for all of the risk domains we're talking about. All right, and one of the parts of the conversation were, how does one person possibly keep pace with this? All right, just the rate of regulatory change. All right, particularly when you're covering multiple jurisdictions. All right, and then you start to look at financial compliance, operational resiliency, cyber, geolocation, geopolitical, 4th, 5th, nth party. All right, the people side of it is a concern. All right, no one person has all the skills and experience to cover all of those risk domains. All right, so are you looking at a federated or a centralized model to start to look at this? Right, how are you going to score it? In terms of metrics, because you want to be measuring eggs with eggs here. All right, there's no point having a certain level of reporting from a financial tooling, all right, that is typically 0 to 1,000, all right, and then you're getting some cyber scoring that's A to Z, all right. You need to understand how the risks are being calculated, and make sure you've got a uniform metric system. So I think, Stefan, in terms of your experience, what have you seen in terms of financial risk versus compliance risk versus data privacy? All right, has it been relatively disjointed to date, or is it starting to come together?
I think it really depends on the model that's applied within the risk management framework, or the structure that's provided. I'm seeing more and more organizations centralize their first line risk functions, which is absolutely the right thing in my mind to do, especially when you're talking about third party risk, because I've worked with technology functions who have their view of, information security functions that have their view of third-party risk. You have, other parts of the organizations look at it in a different way, as you've described, Sean, and therefore, I, as head of third-party risk, I'm trying to, work with multiple different teams who are all have their own different interpretation of what is considered to be high risk, what is considered to be medium or low. And by centralizing teams under a chief controls officer, or in the first line, you start to get that consistency, at least, and that teamwork ethic towards this considerable risk, this complex risk that is supply chain or third party risk, that consistency. because this isn't scalable. Yes, you can have the best analysts in the world, but if they have too much data or not enough data, they are just doing a lot of manual, data grabbing and monitoring. And when you're talking about hundreds or thousands of suppliers, it's just impossible. It's an impossible task. And I think we have to recognize that the human element of this is really important, but it isn't scalable when you're dealing with this number and this complexity. So we do need to start to leverage technology capabilities in a way I don't think we have seen to date. I think in cyber, we have some maturity in terms of that data grabbing and ability to monitor, but that's way more sophisticated than going online and doing a credit reference check or a kind of financial probity check on a business, or how their firm and culture is coming across, from a compliance point of view in all the jurisdictions that they operate. Are we seeing, and I don't want to mention names here of suppliers, but are we seeing them being held up in court on a regular basis for bribery and corruption charges or otherwise? Because that would indicate that they are not fit and proper to work in some of the organizations I've worked with before. So you've got all of this multitude of data coming from different sources, and it is not single. It's not a single source of the truth that we can then mine and use for those suppliers that we've decided we're going to mine against.
Okay, all right, that's really interesting. And Shelley, from your perspective, how have you seen this work or start to work in organisations? All right, how are organisations changing to be able to try and keep pace with this?
So for large organizations, and boy, I fully support what Stefan has said in so many different aspects. But for large organizations, I think over time you've seen pockets of capability, and the change that I'm seeing now is trying to pull it all together in a more integrated whole. So one of the questions that the board members look at, one of the topics is governance. And my view is, if you can't tell me who is responsible, then by definition, it means nobody's responsible. That's not the same as saying these tasks aren't happening or these issues aren't being dealt with. But if it doesn't come together, it's not being dealt with in a holistic way. And I think that's a big change in terms of expectations. And frankly, in business terms, these are relatively new issues. When I think about making things measurable and what metrics are we using for diversity, equity, and inclusion, for climate, these are relatively new topics in the business world, not new in terms of their essence, but I would say new in trying to operationalize those things. And without some rationalized framework for how we think about these things and how we pull them together into a coherent whole and think about the relative risks and then what actions we should be taking, it's near impossible. So I do think it has to come together. I'm a big believer in enterprise risk management, where you've 3 lines of defense. And typically where it comes together is in that second line, right? Audit, if you will, reviews and examines what's done in the first 2. But the policy, the data consolidation, the risk ranking, in my mind, the best place for that to come together is in a CRO type role, in a, sort of a fundamental risk management role.
That's really interesting, because a lot of questions I get asked in terms of presentations, Q&As, fireside chats like these around what information does the board need, all right, to understand about third-party risk, and how do you present that information, all right? But the other question, the question I typically throw back is, well, who on the board are you delivering this information to, all right? So if you're delivering IT risk information, all right, is that going to resonate with the board? Because the board doesn't speak IT risk, the board speaks business risk. And, who is it the chief risk officer who's on the board meeting delivering that information? have they, typically they've been on that board for quite a long time. They've built relationships, they've built communication with key members. So it's really important to understand what the information is, how to shape it, and the route it's going to go, from the third-party risks through the enterprise risk management team and up through to whoever's going to deliver that to the board. Stefan, have you got much experience in terms of how that's worked in the past?
How I would like it to work and how it works in the past are two different things. I think the interesting point is, I agree with Shelley, the definition of risk scoring and the definition of how we're going to manage through policy and framework should come from the second line, and it is the CRO's absolute responsibility to set that framework. I think it's the complexity and the capability in the first line is really key then, but if we look at the senior management regime in the UK, and you have very clear accountability for certain key risks or activities within the organization, the CRO, yes, should be reporting into the board and saying, this is where we are, this is where I see our biggest risks and biggest concerns. But that should be backed up by the chief operating officer, who may own technology risk or otherwise. And they should have a view on the third parties within their space who are likely to impact their risk management capabilities. So yes, as a CRO, I will report into every board, and I would sit in every board meeting and report, my current views. But the COO, the CFO, the material risk takers within the organization should also be able to articulate their view of third-party risk in those board meetings and be able to say, we have no concerns of the third parties that support my functions and therefore my risks are well managed. Or we have severe concerns about X, Y, and Z because we are working with the second line function, but we also know from the first line that we are seeing some real control deficiencies in cyber or otherwise. So I think that connectivity between the CRO's perspective and the individuals who own the risks needs to be expanded out so that they understand that they also own the third-party capabilities that support their ability to do their job in a well-managed way. And that doesn't necessarily always come through. It's not driven. I would make it explicit as part of their board updates that they should be talking about their supply chain and their resiliency. So it makes them fundamentally responsible, which they are, for that very explicit point. And I don't think that happens quite as often as it should do, because that would then drive, I think, more investment into the organization to help them understand the third-party supply chain risk within their individual areas.
Thank you. So if we change tack slightly now, if you don't mind. Regulatory challenges, all right. There's an awful lot of changes going on, all right. An ever increased amount of scrutiny. Can we just talk about a question to Shelley, please? Your experiences of what's keeping you awake at night at the moment. We alluded to ESG, we've alluded to geopolitical earlier in the conversations. If we can do a bit more of a deep dive into regulatory compliance and what the challenges are that we're facing as an industry at the moment.
So it's a great question, and maybe I'm going to step back with a broader answer than perhaps you're looking for. But I spend my time, I serve on multiple boards and I advise companies. So I'm in touch with a lot of different companies, which is different from when I was an operating executive. And I would say there are 4 common themes that I see that every boardroom is looking at and thinking about. And the first is business model changes. So all the changes from new technology, post-pandemic, customer preferences, new competition. So the business model changes, and fundamentally, do we have the right strategy in place, which is probably first and foremost what board members are responsible. So it's business model changes. Second is risk and resiliency. Third is what I'll call corporate citizenship, which really is a new category of voice and trust and DE&I and ESG and climate and all of the sort of new ways of thinking about the world, kind of new social contracts, if you will.
Yeah.
And then talent and culture, because whether it's all the health and personnel related issues or work from home or all of those issues that the pandemic brought up, or just the skills requirement in the way the world is changing and the sophistication that's needed in terms of the skill set, and then the cultural underpinnings around that. So I don't know who said it, but I love the phrase that it's something along the lines of culture is what people do when no one else is looking, right? What's your DNA? What are your fundamental guiding principles in terms of how you operate? Those topics are on every board's agenda, regardless of industry, regardless of location, but it is about the sustainability, the success, the risk resiliency, the talent, and the citizenship of those organizations. Some of that is being driven by investors, some of that is being driven by employees, some of that is being driven by regulators. And one of the complexities of both line management and board members is really understanding all of those drivers and how those drivers fit together, because it means you have many masters, you have many constituencies, you have many stakeholders that you need to be responsive to. And it's just not easy. Certainly in financial services, both I know the UK and in the US, there is a fairly heavy set of regulatory and disclosure expectations, and staying abreast of that and staying current, and again, being able to anticipate what's coming down the road in terms of data requirements and disclosure requirements, that is all critical. But it's a very complex set of factors and dynamics. And to pick up on something Stefan said is, we as board members need from management the connectivity. That's a great word, because a board is not responsible for the activities of an individual area. They're responsible for the sustainability and success of the entire enterprise. So it is really incumbent upon management to make sure that connectivity exists and that it's not narrow. Just sort of to end my comments, I read in Wired magazine recently, it was a great quote from somebody from Microsoft. And he said, when you ship software, you shouldn't ship your organization. Meaning your clients, your constituencies shouldn't care how you are organized internally, right? You are a single enterprise. And again, back to the connectivity word that I think is just perfect. That's one of the key things that management needs to provide, is that view, that connectivity across the enterprise.
So a lot of that is around sustainability now, with organisations setting their stall out as being, much greener. All right, and we've seen quite a lot of organisations, put some very bold statements out there. We've seen some quite large financial organisations then rescind some of those statements fairly quickly. All right, they were a little bit quick to the gun. So certainly, it's really fascinating to look at, ESG and kind of break it down between, from a transatlantic perspective. From the US, it seems to be very much driven from a DEI perspective, diversity, equality, inclusion. All right, not decrying climate in any way, shape, or form, but that's the priorities in terms of it. Whereas certainly my experience in the UK/EU is that while those things are very important, climate and TCFD reporting is now becoming front and center, and people are starting to realize just how challenging that really is. So in terms of climate and carbon, all right, measuring greenhouse gas emissions, a lot of organizations have been looking inwardly for some time around, transport to work. Obviously remote working, work from home because of the pandemic has helped with that. What are the heating, lighting, energy consumption in relation to their businesses, and they're only just starting to look at their supply chain. However, the challenge there is that, unlike, the data side of things where it's typically third and fourth party, all right, occasionally fifth and sixth if you in some instances, but with ESG, it's right the way down to that raw material manufacture, all right, right to the manufacturer point, all right. And not only do you look down the food chain, you also look back up the food chain, and you look at, what are we producing and how is that being consumed, and what energy is that using, and how much carbon is that contributing. So it's been really quite interesting talking to an awful lot of people over the past 6 months, really, about the challenges, quite similar to fourth and end party and things like concentration risk in a lot of ways in terms of the methods you need, but equally really interesting in terms of a lot of your supply chain don't know. If you're going to buy a well-known brand of laptop or PC or server or whatever, all right, the carbon used to generate that product is on the side of the box. That's a pretty easy thing to achieve. But if you're buying some of your materials or some of your products or components from smaller organizations, frequently the answer is, I don't know. So how, as a larger organization, can you possibly start to report this information if that material, if that raw data just isn't available at this moment in time? And that's some of the challenges we're looking to face at this moment. So any thoughts on that, Stefan, or indeed Shelley?
If I could unmute, I think I'm having that's the common pandemic risk. So I've always been a very strong supporter of operating in an ethical, socially aware, environmentally friendly manner. I think for me, it just adds another degree of complexity and question set that we need to ask of our supply chain. I, for the first time last year, did a bit of work for Refinitiv, who were a third party. They merged with London Stock Exchange Group early last year, yeah. And they became a financial services regulated entity overnight. And it's a real struggle for third parties. This is not, specific to Refinitiv. It's a real struggle for organizations, especially very large organizations who have not been regulated previously, to understand what they're now facing into from a financial services perspective. And I'll deal with financial services. The compliance elements there are just, are many and varied, and they just don't have the capability, or they are building the capability, but it's some way behind the front end financial services organization that the regulators are throwing these rules and regulations at. And if we think, and I'm going to be quite controversial here, I know regulators do a fantastic job most of the time. They also struggle at times with the amount of resource that they've got available to them. But when they're asking organizations, they don't care if an organization is able to meet the deadline that they have set. They can go through all the consultation papers and that process, but ultimately they can provide the rules and regulations that they expect to happen. It is up to the organization then to comply with that. How we do that is going to be really difficult at times, especially around operational resilience, ESG, etc., etc. But they have the luxury of being able to say, well, we've defined the rules, we've had these rules agreed, you've had the consultation, you must now comply with that. And that's where it gets difficult. So it's not difficult for them to set the rules, because conceptually they're creating a framework. from scratch normally, especially around resilience. You know, that's been in development for, you know, 5, 6, 7, 8 years, but they don't care about legacy. They don't care about how you've structured your supply chain. They don't care. You have got to comply. And that's when the difficulty arises. So we have no excuse. We have to comply with that. They give us time to comply with that. And it is our responsibility to give the board, I mean, as Shelley said, we are one single enterprise, you know, and we should be able to represent or present ourselves as one single enterprise. And it doesn't matter how much we complain about complexity, etc. We have to deal with it. And I think for me, we're beginning to see the embryonic creation within supply chain of more understanding in the fourth and fifth party estate. It's beginning to come along. We're beginning to see data being used in much more sophisticated ways with resource over the top. But if we expect our traditional model of just being resource heavy or labor heavy, we just know it's not going to work. It's bound to fail. So we have to invest. We have to deal with the complexity that the regulator has thrown at us in order to continue to operate and give the board the confidence that we are one single enterprise in how we manage risk. There's just no getting away from it in financial services.
Okay. Anything to add, Shelley?
No, just the idea that, look, supply chain is on the radar screen in a way 2 years ago, it just wasn't. People understood we lived in an ecosystem world where we have partners and suppliers, and no entity exists in a vacuum, but understanding the interactions and understanding the suppliers of your suppliers and going deep into the supply chain, the focus and scrutiny on that is greater than ever, and the expectations for disclosure of those issues is greater than ever. And again, purely from an operational perspective, it is impossible to throw manpower at this and make it work. It is impossible to use spreadsheets to pull it together. It requires so much data and the ability to sort through the data. And frankly, we all know this. AI and machine learning are about the ability to learn from the data. And that's really what's required. And granted, that is very easy to say and much less easy to do. But that's the direction certainly every financial entity has to move in. But I would argue almost every entity has to move in. It is impossible to do it without a lot of technological help and a lot of really, really good, again, as I said before, broad, deep, current data. That's just required, or it becomes impossible, insurmountable.
Thank you. One question that we had from a registrant, which I've just been saving to the last, came from a gentleman who works for a utility company, a water company here in the UK. He'd like to know the panel's thoughts on ways to rank / categorize vendors to ensure that we spend the appropriate resources managing compliance with the genuinely risky suppliers and not wasting time assessing low impact vendors in depth. I have my own thoughts on this, but I'll open it up to either of you, whoever wants to volunteer to pass comment.
I'm happy to go first, Shelley. Utility companies, and as Shelley said, we should not just focus on financial services organizations. I think what's really important is understanding where the organization's critical risks are and then driving that down into your supply chain. So what keeps the board awake at night? What keeps the executive awake at night, you know, from a utilities perspective? Is it pollution? Is it, you know, the whole environmental agenda? And which are your suppliers that, you know, are most likely to cause you harm if they fail to operate in the way that you expect them to operate? How do you rank them? Well, again, you know, that's quite subjective. A lot of organizations have different ways of ranking. I don't want to use the terminology that we use in financial services, because that gets, you know, that gets quite complex. But, you know, it can be as simple as, you know, literally high, medium, and low, but come up with a criteria of what constitutes a high risk vendor or a supplier to you as an organization. That doesn't matter whether you're in financial services or utilities. It's about then saying, you know, what are our key risks? Is it, you know, do we hold personal data? For a utilities company, if they're at the front end, they will hold personal data. Therefore, cyber risk is going to be one of those. So if that company is, you know, regularly holding and processing data of, you know, many millions of customers, then automatically from a cyber perspective, you're going to say that they're pretty high on the risk agenda. Therefore, you need to be monitoring them. You know, so it's come up with a criteria that fits for that utility company, evidence it, agree it with the board, and then drive that into your supply chain and identify where your high risk suppliers are. Because without that, you're fighting against hundreds of suppliers. So if you can get it down to at least a manageable number, you then can start to then apply the data requirements that Shelley has quite eloquently described around, you know, we need to make use of AI. We need to make use of more of this technology-driven data that is available to us that wasn't available 4, 5, 6 years ago.
Thank you. Anything to add, Shelley?
Sure. You know, when I think of successful risk management programs I've seen, what they start with is a relatively small number. So let's call it single digits, you know, 8, 9, 10, well, double digits, but a relatively small number, fewer than a dozen, it could be even 6 of the key business risks. So I would freely say that I don't understand the industry this individual is talking about, but what are the top business risks at a very fundamental level? To interrupt operation, to interrupt capacity, to have an environmental disaster. So start by forgetting the how those risks might be triggered. Start with the what are the key business risks that are the most material and are the most problematic. And then I would cascade down from there in terms of what are the scenarios that might lead to those risks and who are the key players, who are the key partners, suppliers, whatever, that may impact those scenarios. But I think the most important thing is to think about it just in fundamental business terms. And I have to say, I think, having spent a lot of time in the technology community and the information security community, that community at large has done a great disservice to the business world because they have couched all these risks in a lot of geek speak and techno terms. And that's not what's needed. What's needed is what are the key business scenarios and business risks that we want to prevent, and what are the material business risks, and then cascade down in terms of how those happen. But in my experience, that's the most helpful way to think about it, which you could probably take a pretty good shot at, you know, with 3 people sitting down with a yellow legal pad in a conference room in terms of identifying the key business risks. And then you change and tweak and grow that over time. So it's also, I like to call it a continuous improvement process, because you learn from happenings in your own environment, you learn from happenings in the outside world.
And from those, you develop what we typically call the killer questions, which allow you to carry out that inherent risk calculation. All right, are they, you know, high, medium, low? All right, where or critical? You know, where do they fall? And you have the beginnings of a framework. All right, ultimately. All right. The harder part is then presenting that framework back and getting management buy-in, which is a conversation for a whole different fireside chat. But in terms of that, you know, you may well build into that framework that they are doing a questionnaire once a year, that they are doing for criticals and highs, that they do need to continuously monitor for criticals and highs. and maybe, you know, lesser levels of due diligence as you move down that perceived risk model. Right? But ultimately, yeah, identifying the criteria that are important to you, all right, to shape that decision-making process and gaining management buy-in for that is really important. And certainly the individuals, I think, who I do know work at this particular organisation, all right, you know, the thing to think about is perhaps building a steering committee, not just with the cyber team, but, you know, with your legal counsel, with the compliance team, with data privacy, however the organisation's divided up, and start to build that framework and that programme up, or as a joint effort. All right, don't just try and do it from the information security of the cyber side. So, I'm conscious of time, ladies and gentlemen. All right, so I just, Duncan, if you could just move to the last slide, please, and bring that up. So I just want to kind of, you know, set the scene as I see it and try and put a positive slant on all of this. So clearly, there's a huge amount going on in the world. Some of the things here are a small sample of the challenges that we're facing. You know, thinking back to the beginning of the COVID pandemic, we were quite concerned about COVID and not being able to get into work. And I was saying to Stefan and Shelley earlier on, you know, one of our clients has got data centers in Manila, and at the same time as COVID and not being able to visit and manage those data centers and work remotely, they also had a cascade event and they had earthquakes and power outages remotely as well. If we look back, perhaps fondly with only those two cascade risks to deal with, all right, and we now look at Log4j, SolarWinds, you started to look at ever-increasing ransomware attacks, all of the climate change implications, the UK self-inflicted Brexit scenarios, all those challenge supply chain delivery before we even start to get to Russia and Ukraine and the impact on that. So, you know, we really are looking at it from an exponential growth, and it's no wonder that supply chain risk is front and center of any board these days. You know, just the one challenge of figuring out whether any of our supply chain is under sanctions with Russia. All right, that's a daunting task in itself. All right, so yeah, the information is key. Timely and up-to-date information is key. And if anybody would like to come and talk to us about that in the future, all right, then please reach out to do so. Duncan, if you could just move to the last slide, please. So contact details are on this slide. Slides will be made available, as will the recording, to everybody on the panel here. I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank Shelley and Stefan for their time and their absolutely wonderful insights, and hope that this has been of value to everybody, and look forward to seeing you all on the next event. Thanks very much indeed, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks all.